Welcome to the Grief Ladies, the practical guide to what comes next. I'm Kelly Daugherty.
And I'm Karyn Arnold, and we are two grief professionals with over 50 years of combined experience. We're here to validate, educate, and give you tangible tools you can actually use.
Each episode motivates you to take action and reminds you it's okay to want to feel better. This is the Grief Ladies, a guide to what comes next. Hi, and welcome back to the Grief Podcast. I'm Kelly Daugherty. I'm here with my co-host, Karyn Arnold. And today's topic, we're continuing with our grief framework. So if you haven't watched or listened to the previous episodes, please make sure you do so. Our goal for this podcast is to be able to give you practical tools to be able to help you on your grief experience. So the grief framework is 5 letters, standing for grounding for G, R for rebuilding, I, interacting, E, evolving, and F, finding. So today's episode, we are talking about interacting, which I know is one of Karyn's favorite topics. So we'll see how long this one goes today, because I think there's a lot we can talk about. But before we get started, really our goal with these first several episodes, the first 6 episodes, are really to go over the grief framework, also to validate and normalize your grief experiences and know that what you're going through is probably pretty normal, and also provide you some hope and guidance and begin to start talking about some goals you can do for yourself. And we're going to start talking about some tools, but, stay tuned, because our future sessions really are going to be full of amazing guests. They're going to be joining us that are really specific topics like sleep issues, organizing, dealing with relationships, working on coping skills, and things like that. So we're definitely going to go into way more detail in certain areas in future episodes. So stay tuned. But for today, we are going to be talking about interacting. And so as we've talked about in the previous episodes, we're kind of basing our grief framework kind of like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So it's a foundation, almost a pyramid. And so we're moving up the pyramid, and we are working on that relationships and communication. And so last time we talked about the importance of building structure in your grief, and how creating supportive routines can actually build momentum and actually start building upon and helping you on your grief journey. So we asked you to start paying attention and observing some things like your routines, and, leave us a comment. Tell us what you noticed and what you observed. Did you make any shifts or any changes? And we'd love to hear this. So we're talking about really this progression, right? We're continuing to build on a progression. And so we know that relationships provide support, but they also require energy we may not have when we're grieving, because as we've talked about, sleep can be impacted. Even if you're sleeping well, you can still feel exhausted because there's so much fatigue with grief. We're also talking about understanding current relationship dynamics and certain choices that we have to make sometimes. And then also remembering that small steps in connection can build confidence in our ability to relate to others. So I'm going to pass it over now to Karyn, so she can probably get a bit on her soapbox and help us understand what interacting is.
Yes, well, thank you, Kelly. And as you said, this is one of my favorite topics. And probably just because I think communication is so important, and also just because I see people struggling with this all the time. The reason why we chose I for interacting is because that's what we are always doing. What's interesting, it's one of those paradoxes, one of the many in grief that we talk about, that as you're grieving, you're sort of, turning inward more and focusing on yourself in ways that you never have. Just, really trying to put one foot in front of the other to function and get through the day, and the challenges of that. And it can be really hard to be worried about other people and what they're doing, what they're thinking, in ways that you would have before. People tend to have those like perfectionist, people-pleasing qualities, and you just probably don't have the energy, maybe the interest to do that. At the same time, people are very much a part of our lives, and we can see this in all kinds of ways, with the way people show up, and the ways they don't, and the ways that we are trying to navigate where we are able to turn in the midst of our grief. So that interacting is really, really important. So, the thing is, there's all different levels to this. And I was saying to you, I literally just did a program on this afternoon. So this is very fresh. And I had a whole group of grieving people that had different challenges that they were talking about. But it can happen in all facets. I mean, think about strangers, going into a doctor's office and somebody asking, about your current situation. And it's like, okay, how much am I going to share? Or you end up at a social gathering and you're talking to a friend of a friend, maybe somebody you could make a connection with, but you're not sure how much you want to share. We can feel really challenged by the fact that people didn't know us before. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Then we move into the realm of our other close relationships that we have. And even the people maybe that we share living space with. And we're going to have expectations for each group of people and hopes for what that's going to look like. So it oftentimes feels like nobody understands. That's something that I hear from people a lot. And I think it can be really exhausting trying to maintain all of these relationships while you are grieving. And I think maybe our hope is sometimes that people would just kind of come in and just wrap us up in the support and know exactly what to say and how to help us. But I don't think we find that, to be the case too often. So, this is very normal. I think, we often feel like we're in a totally different space now. I've had people describe it, they just feel like they've landed on a different planet. So there's conversations of people going on around them, and they just feel like they're not connected to them and they're struggling to participate with them. And so that can feel very lonely. I mean, that's one thing that's important to remember, that I'll always say, even surrounded by people, maybe especially surrounded by people, is when we are going to feel our loneliness. And we have to remember too that we've also had a very big change in ourselves and who we are and the way we look at the world, the things that matter to us, just our own personality has had a shift. So if we take all of these factors and put them together, we can see why there would be this really huge change and why it would suddenly become so difficult.
Yeah, I mean, it's the reality is relationships sometimes change when we're grieving, right? And sometimes over time they may go back to the way they were. But I think the key, what you mentioned, is expectations. And I think that's what I hear so much from my clients is they have expectations about how people are going to show up for them, and then they're let down. Right. And, one of the things, like, I talk a lot about the five love languages, and we all have these love languages. And maybe we'll have to find somebody to come on and talk a little bit
Mhm.
more about this. But, we need different things from our partner. Right. And I think we also, when we're grieving, we need different things from different people. And sometimes we have these expectations that because maybe we've done this for them and we've been there for them when they experienced a grief, that they're going to be there for us, and then we get let down. And what I hear a lot of people talk about is the resentment, also feeling so different from their friends and family. I heard somebody say, I walked into a church and I can feel everybody's eyes on me, looking at me like, oh, here's the grieving mom, right? So feeling like that, getting that puppy dog look, and just not feeling so different, and those relationships really changing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really there's so much that goes along with it because there's, as you said, the people that you really had the expectations for that you hoped would be present. And it can be really frustrating and really surprising. And I think a lot of times, like, our kind of go to is like, well, if they haven't been through it, then they just don't understand. I hear people say that a lot. But there are those situations sometimes where there is a connection, maybe where someone else did have a similar loss, but their relationship with that person was very different, their own coping skills, their history. So they're kind of coming in with an expectation of how you should be acting because they went through it already. So it feels like, regardless, you can find challenges with all of this. So I think what we're trying to do here today, initially at least, is again to normalize this. I think this is a huge surprise for people. One of the people said in my group today, I lost my husband, but I didn't expect to lose everybody else too.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what it felt like for her, is that all of these relationships that she had been counting on. Um, Kelly, where do you think people find this? I guess I'm kind of setting it up because I notice a lot of times that there's situations where people have higher expectations than others. Where do you think people's expectations can be the highest for this in terms of what they would hope for from someone?
Oh, there's so many. I think it's so varied, right? Everybody's grief is so unique and different, but I think people not bringing up their loved one to them,
Mhm.
people not remembering maybe the anniversary of the death or their loved one's birthday. I've heard people say, "Oh, now that I'm in year 2, people are not remembering that it's my loved one's birthday," right? These expectations that people are going to know what to say.
Mhm.
And we've talked about this previously many times, but like sometimes people say really stupid things, even at the funeral, right? What are you going to do with the house now that she died?
Yeah.
Like I've gotten that far, right? So I think it's just varies,
Yes.
Um, I know even after my dad died, I had a little bit of expectation that people were gonna kind of check in with me. And I did. I had several people do that, but I also had several people who didn't and have
Yeah.
never said anything to me like, "How are you doing since your dad died?" I want something like specific like that because I'm comfortable about talking about it, right? So that hasn't, certain people absolutely have, like Karen, but other people haven't. And so I had these expectations that people were going to be more supportive than they were,
Yeah.
unfortunately. And I think expectations that people aren't going to say stupid things.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And that's and we don't think we have expectations. If you ask somebody to listen, they wouldn't be able to do that. But yet, as soon as an expectation's not met, you realize you did have one,
Hmm.
maybe that you
Hmm.
didn't think was going to be there. I know what comes up a lot, I think where people feel frustrated or disappointed a lot is just within their family, with
Hmm.
it. And what I say to people a lot is that like you talk about like family and the importance of family. People find those wooden signs that they hang in their house that say family. This is just the most important thing. And we feel like, we've got this shared grief and that we are all united in this and we're going to look out for each other and take care of each other. And just the way you're responding, I know that you already hear otherwise that family is oftentimes one of the harder places to get
Mm.
support because everybody's dealing with it. You know,
Exactly.
sometimes it's a little easier and safer for our friend or our coworker to kind of chime in or check with us because hopefully their life is okay at that moment and they
Yeah.
have the space and the energy to do that. But our own family just really may not be able to do that. I also think what comes up sometimes is talk about expectations, the idea that everybody should be grieving the same way, especially amongst siblings, who all lost a parent. Um, or even, with people who have had a loss and it like they're the child and then their parent lost their spouse. And they're thinking like, well, why can't mom move on? I'm trying to move forward. Why is she still struggling so much? So it's just interesting how I think family can almost be kind of tough on each other sometimes, but it's because they're going through so much on their own.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I also think that there's a lot of challenges that come up when we're trying to communicate when we're grieving. There's a lot of the things people will talk about is like, well, somebody asks how I'm doing. Do I tell them the truth?
Yeah.
Do I say that or not? Right. People say things that are dismissive of your grief, that are minimizing your grief. I heard a lot of, well, your dad was old. It's like, I was like, really? That's what you're going to tell me? People are also worried about going to social events because their grief is heavy and they're afraid that they're going to ruin it for everybody. And as I had one teenage girl say this to me perfectly, she said her mom died. And she said, when am I going to start giving a shit like about things like my friends do? She's like, they're all worried about such stupid things. And here I am like, really? That's what you're worried about? She's like, am I going to get back to like being upset about those little things again? And I was like, yes, you will.
Yeah. It is interesting though, right? I mean, it does really talk about why those connections are so hard. Because we have to remember that a lot of our relationships, especially when we talk about friendships or, maybe coworkers, those connections have a kind of a specific origin, and in terms of what brought that relationship together in the first place. Maybe it's a mom's group and, your kids all, played together or something, or it was like an art class that you took, or all of your neighbors. So those things that sort of matter initially for connections Once you have a really significant loss, that takes up all the space, all of it.
Yep.
It's all going toward that, and there's just not a lot of room for anything left over. So if you're feeling kind of uninterested or disconnected, there's a really good reason why. And it's hard to fake it. I mean, a lot of people that are
Yes.
grieving are already walking around with sort of that mask on. So to be trying to jump into conversations and participating just feels really inauthentic. And I think people are trying to avoid that if they can.
Yep. And I think, going back to the expectations, I have a friend of mine who just had a significant loss, and she posted something a couple of weeks ago, which was I think most grieving people could relate to. And it basically said was, I may look a certain way, but I'm not okay.
Mhm,
You may see me smile sometimes because I want to smile, and other times because I'm expected to smile.
mhm,
Right. And she said, and just because I'm getting up every day and working doesn't mean I'm brave, doesn't mean I'm okay. Right. And so I think even like what I hear a lot of times people say is to grieving people, oh, you look so good.
mhm.
And they're like, what? Like, and they feel bad about that. They're like, well, I'm not okay. Like, why are you saying I look good?
Yeah.
And what I always say is people want us to be okay, right? So that they see us with our mask on and acting a certain way, they feel better.
Mhm.
Right?
Absolutely.
They don't have to, okay, I don't have to worry about her. She's doing okay, right? But the reality is like that's really sometimes pretty insulting to people. I had one woman, she lost so much weight after her child died, and people were like, "You look so great. You've lost so much weight." And she's like, "Yeah, cuz my child died."
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's like when people say, "Oh, you're so strong." I know people really do not
Uh-huh.
like that. Like what
Nope.
what do you expect me to be doing? I've had
Mhm.
people, go so far as like again with a woman who lost her child, and someone had said, "If it were me, I don't even think I could function." And, again, these things I think are meant to be compliments, I guess. But
Mhm.
then, for the grieving person, it's like, so what are you saying? You love your kid more than me because you wouldn't be able to function and I can? What is that saying
Yep.
about my
Yeah,
love or my
exactly.
loyalty or anything else? So, all of those things that sound like we're trying to point out how well a person is doing are usually not very, very helpful to people. So, it's like, you're just dodging that stuff everywhere you go, whether it's statements or questions. I mean, gosh, Kelly, we really could go on about
I
this
know.
for so, so long. And we're going to. I mean, we are going to talk about it a lot because it's whether people are making suggestions about your life and what they feel like you should be doing, if they are imposing timelines on you and feeling impatient. We also have to remember that a lot of times this is coming internally. Even if people aren't saying things, we also have our own expectations or we worry about being a burden. I have people come to me sometimes for help because they say, you know what, I just can't keep saying the same things to the same people. We feel like we're a broken record. I don't know, people
Exactly.
want to know what's going on in my life. I don't have anything new to tell them. Same old stuff, still
Mhm.
grieving,
Mhm.
still trying to
Yeah.
figure out my life over here.
Yeah, and I agree. It goes back again to expectations. Like we have this expectation that our friends don't want to hear us talk anymore about this.
Yeah.
We don't know that. That is an assumption we're making, right? And so I hear that all the time. Well, I don't bring it up anymore because I don't want to talk to them. But then I also have heard awful things where like a client of mine talks about how like her best friend was great in the beginning after her loss, and then about 6 months later she said, "Okay, I've listened long enough. You need to get over this now."
Mm, yeah.
So, sometimes our I think assumptions may be right. But we don't always know that, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's always like, "Hey, can I talk about this right now? Are you okay with me being able to talk about this?" And, I think for people who are listening, maybe that are supporting grieving individuals, there isn't anything you're going to say that's going to take away their grief.
Hmm.
But it is about that connection. And it is about being there for them and holding that space for them to listen, to talk to you, right? And you can listen to them and just be there.
Yeah.
You don't have, there's no magical words that's going to make them feel better and get over their grief. That's not the way it works.
Yeah.
But just acknowledge, maybe use their loved one's name, be sincere. That's what I think it really comes down to.
Absolutely. I mean, as soon as we realize, like, you have no power to actually take anything away or to help or fix this for anybody, it can take a lot of pressure off. And,
Mhm.
grieving people aren't looking for this to be fixed. And I think that's sometimes where people really struggle because they
Mm.
feel inept and they just feel like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. Like I had my line that I say, in the receiving line of the funeral, or I sent a casserole over or something, like, but I don't know what to do after that. And I think if people could understand that, like, it's not that a grieving person has a specific expectation. And let's face it, that's what makes it very hard, because even if I were to say, Kelly, like, what exactly do you need? You'd be like, I don't know. Some days I want to talk about it and not talk about it all in the same day, so we can see why it's hard for other people. So I don't think we're looking for specifics as much as we are looking for grace, time, patience, not to feel rushed through it, not to feel judged. If a person could be giving that to a griever, what a difference that would make,
Yes.
truly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so Karen, what do you think are some of the types of relationship changes that come up in grief?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. And again, time definitely impacts this. As you said, there's points where people feel supported in the beginning if they're lucky. And what's confusing is that just as people are starting to move into the parts of their grief where things where the reality and the finality are hitting in certain ways, people are kind of going back to their lives. So it's not just one type as much as even the relationships that can be initially supportive are drifting and changing. But I think we can have the whole range. I mean, again, I would love to bring my group that we just had, because they had, from people with all out anger and resentment, people who made promises, to one woman, to her dying husband, a person made promises to care for her and has not shown up at all in the aftermath, and the challenges of that. To trying to navigate like family relationships and people not being able to handle the changes that they see in us. I think we can feel incredibly disappointed by people. We feel like we've invested a time into the relationship, I should say, through the years. And we'd like to think that, isn't this what our closest relationships are for? When times get tough, people are going to be here for us. And I find that a lot of people are seeing that as the opposite. When times get tough, people kind of go in the opposite direction. So there's a lot of different, people can be absent, people can be saying the wrong things, people can be overly opinionated or trying to fix everything. So it's like, I don't know which one's worse, but they're all hard.
Mhm.
That's for
Yeah.
sure.
Well, and I was also thinking, because this has been coming up more and more recently, is sometimes our relationship with the person who died changes as well.
For sure.
Because sometimes we find out things about that person or that relationship. We go through their cell phone, we go through their email, we find out things that maybe you didn't know, which then is, a whole other topic that we should be talking about with evolving probably. But
Yeah.
um how that can even change how you thought your relationship was. I've worked with several people like that, and how difficult that is.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and just even recognizing that your relationship with your loved one way or another, is
Mhm.
something you're trying to continuously interact with. So, again, anytime we talk about the challenges of grief, we can see why, because people are really being bombarded, with so much all the time.
Yeah.
They really,
Yeah.
really are. So, I guess the final thing, we kind of mentioned this already before, but what's really confusing is how often we talk to people about loneliness. And that can come in a lot of different forms. If you've lost the person that you shared living space with, or the person who was your cheerleader, your advocate, your decision maker, your travel companion, all the types of loneliness. But grief, we have to remember, just the experience of it is its own lonely journey. And people really do struggle. And what's confusing about it is that in other parts of our life, if we're tired, I'll sleep. If I'm hungry, I'll eat. And we think, if I'm lonely, well, then I guess I need to be with people. And then in grief, it doesn't quite work that way. So that's why the importance of trying to figure out how to navigate these relationships really cannot be overstated. And we really need to figure out ways to communicate and be expressing our needs, because the disappointing part of this is that people don't really figure this out for us. We have to be the ones to do the educating, to do the communicating. And early on, you just may not have that in you, but down the road, it's going to be something that if you can do it, it does benefit you. It is to your
Yeah.
benefit.
Yeah. And I think, obviously, Karen, you and I both love doing grief groups. And so we see the how beneficial they can be, right? Especially for people who are struggling with that loneliness or feeling like no one is going through it. I mean, as I shared probably in the first episode, walking into that room and seeing those other teen girls after my mom died and knowing I wasn't alone was probably one of the most instrumental things in my grief journey.
Absolutely.
And so being able to find that support from people who get it and are in it can be really beneficial.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. For sure. So, it's going to be something we'll continue to talk about. What would you suggest people do with this information going forward? What can we make a takeaway from this?
So, as we've been mentioning, right, we're kind of in this awareness phase, right? We're just asking you to be aware of what we're talking about and then observing your interactions with other people. So, just kind of notice for the next 3 days or so without judgment, so no beating yourself up, how you're currently connecting with other people. You can track it, write it down, maybe make some notes. Who are you trying to connect with right now? Who feels the best to connect with? What types of conversations do you find valuable? Or are some supportive and some just really draining and you're like, oh, I can't deal with them today, right? And how do you respond when somebody asks how you're doing?
Yeah.
Does it depend on who it is? Because I do think that is definitely probably the case for many, but think about that. Are you honest? Do you say how you're truly doing? And what are the relationships that feel different? Are there some of those secondary losses? It's not just the primary loss. Sometimes those secondary losses, like you mentioned, Karen, at the beginning, right? A widow. Sometimes they lose a lot of family or friends because they were their couple friends, right?
Mhm.
And they feel like a fifth wheel now or a third wheel. And so they don't go out with those people anymore. Um, where do you feel understood and not, least understood? And then what communication patterns are you avoiding? So these are just some general questions. You're not expected to answer all of these, but we just want you to open up your awareness and notice your interactions for the next few days with people. What feels good? What doesn't? I think one of the best questions you can ask is this helping or hurting?
Mm,
Right? And
absolutely.
if certain people aren't helping, then maybe you move on. So again, it is about practicing self-compassion and being kind to yourself, not beating yourself up, not giving yourself these expectations. Oh, I should be doing this or I should reach out to them or whatever. Just be kind. Just notice.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and as we've said, as we're encouraging people to do this, it's really interesting. And I'll tell you, that was the exercise I had the last group I did. It was a 2-part, and this was our second one today. And in between, that was sort of what I had encouraged everybody to do was sort of the observation, the awareness, maybe some writing to go along with it. And people were really surprised. There was things that they hadn't really expected. And as one woman said, it's so interesting when you take that step outside of yourself for a moment and just kind of take that step back and watch things a little bit that you just get a different view. So, we're going to be continuing to do this next week. We are going to be moving on to E, which is for evolving. I actually really like this I guess I like all the topics in some ways, but this one as well, because we're going to be talking about self esteem, which I think does not get enough attention with how much that is impacted through the grief process and how much that may be hurting you, that diminished self esteem. And also some of the complex emotions in grief, like anger and guilt, regret, resentment. I kind of call them the ugly emotions of grief, some of the things that we don't even like to think, let alone say out loud. So we're going to be exploring all of that. So we'll look forward to having you back for the next one. Please make sure that you are leaving comments, that you are sharing, that you're participating. We are doing all of this for you and we like to hear from you. So please don't hesitate to be reaching out anytime. Kelly, thank you so much for everything
Thank
today
you.
and look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Grief Ladies. Don't wait to feel better to get started. Getting started is what makes you feel better. Put this week's tool to work. If today's episode helped, share it with someone who needs it and leave us a review. We'd love to hear from you.
And remember, we're here for you, your trusted grief ladies, navigating this path together.